Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Elisa Demena, and today we're going to go over a little bit about muscle physiology. Just an introduction lightly, just to introduce you to who's in the neighborhood and what they basically do there. First thing you need to know is that we have three types of muscle, which compared to some of the other tissue types is probably very reassuring. Okay, there's only three, yay. So let's talk about who's there. Um, let's actually start over here with the smooth muscle group. The smooth muscle group is considered to be a little bit less complex. So although it contracts and it relaxes, which is the hallmark of what muscle does, it allows for movement using contractions and relaxations. It's single-celled and it's found mainly in all of the luminous or like a lumen's like inside of a tube, right? So, for example, your digestive tract or your respiratory system or your vasculature, they're all just a system of tubes. And those tubes need to expand and contract regularly in order to kind of push their cargo through, right? Be it blood, be it your tacos from lunch, and so this allows for that regular movement. They're only one cell big. They only have one nucleus, so they're mononucleated type cells. The next level of cell is really only found in one place. So it's not all over the body. It's just in the heart, not the blood vessels, right? So that's back to smooth muscle, but the cardiac tissues, the walls of the heart. And so they have to do something very different. So instead of a lumen or a tube, they have to kind of, there's this conical, well, heart-shaped, I guess, right, organ, and it has to kind of have these different pulsating motion, right? And so we have to get blood from all four chambers of the heart back to the lungs, back into the body, back from the lungs. And so it needs to coordinate all of those actions. And in order to do that, it has a different structure. That structure is important. And down here, I'm going to get, hey, it's muscle. Let's do red, right? Okay, right here. I want you to take a look at this little picture right there, that diagram. So that diagram shows cardiac muscle, all right? And it looks different from smooth muscle in that some of them have two nuclei and some of them have one. It can be what we call uni or binucleated. So it begins to do this thing called fusion, right? So these cells, two distinct cells, become one bigger cell, and that allows them to have a different shape and maybe a little bit more dexterity and definitely complexity. So inside of these cells, you're going to also notice that they do something kind of funny. Some of them only are one cell big and they have two terminal points, and then other parts, and that different shape allows them to do things like have branches. Whereas you can see this first one up here has a couple of attachment points. It actually has one leg on this side and then two little legs on this side. The one below it has one leg on one side and one leg on the other side. So those legs are actually where we would fuse attachment points, right, to other cells. And so being able to have multiple termini allow it to, instead of just being directional, like one way and the other way, allow it to kind of make a wraparound, a cluster of cell tissue that wraps around the heart, and as each one of them expands and contracts, they're able to facilitate that beating motion that the heart needs to have. All right, the other thing I want you to take a look at in these, I'm going to do, well, let's see if I can do a yellow highlighter. All right, there we go, okay. Oh, there they go, here, these little stripes that you're going to see, these dark pink stripes. Those themselves, those are what we call intercalated discs. And so an intercalated disc is where one muscle cell, cardiac muscle cell, meets another cardiac muscle cell and they join together and they make what we call an intercalated disc. And that's also what helps hold all of those cells in that shape, in that heart shape. Let's see, what's next? Oh, of course, can't forget about this one. All right, so then of course the skeletal muscle right down here. Skeletal muscle is one of my favorites. Skeletal muscle itself is a little bit more complex. So we looked already at cells in muscle that have one nuclei, and then sometimes they have two nuclei or one nuclei, but when it comes to skeletal muscle, which is all over your body, it's just, we've really invested in this. It's super complex, and it has a couple of hallmark structures, one being many nuclei in one cell. So what happens in this process of multinucleation, right? What we have is all kinds of muscle cells that start joining together. And as you can see here, their nuclei, let me get the highlighter back, there's the highlighter, the nuclei kind of like get smooshed up to the side. Now some of these muscles can have like thousands and thousands of fused muscle, original single muscle cells during myoblast fusion, fuse into thousands and thousands of single cells that are now one giant cell. So we've heard the term before, or maybe this is the first time, muscle cell is the same or synonymous to a muscle fiber. And that's really helpful when we're talking about things like cells that have fused together under myoblastic fusion. Other things that you might want to notice too is since all of those muscle cells have squished their nuclei to the sides of the cell, you got to ask, well, what's squishing them? What's in the middle? And what's in the middle is this stuff right here. You're going to see all these little stripes. These are called striations. So striations. Skeletal muscle has a lot of striations, and what those are actually physically the teeny tiniest fundamental contractile unit of muscle. Teeny tiny little machines called sarcomeres would allow for expansion and contraction of muscle. We're going to take a very close-up look at that in another video. All right, so skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Things you need to know about muscle? Well, here's some characteristics. One is it needs to be responsive to the environment. It needs to be able to respond to stimuli. That's called excitability. And whether that's the cluster of muscles in a vessel being stretched to their maximum size, or if it's stimulation from a nerve, it's some type of stimuli from the environment that causes it to undergo that expansion, contraction, right? Or contraction, relaxation. The next one is it needs to be able to, of course, respond as muscle should, and that means being able to contract and relax, right? The next one is extensibility, and so that's kind of this ability to stretch out a little bit, right? So just beyond where it's like happy places. However, that works in conjunction with this next one, elasticity. So elasticity says, well, after it's been stretched, it's not broken, it's not stretched out anymore. It can go back, recoil to that comfortable resting length. So that's what that means. There's this flexibility in muscle, okay? It's all about movement when we're talking about muscle. Things that muscle does, the functions of muscle. Well, just like we said, it produces movement. It's responsible for all of the major movement in the body. So major forms of locomotion, regular peristalsis in the body. So anything from your heart beating to taking a nice breezy walk to eating that taco. I guess I'm just really hungry for tacos. Any of those things, that's all coming down to muscle tissue. Something else it does is whether or not you believe it, it's always actually maintaining some type of position or some type of posture, right? Some type of form to your body. So even now you're relaxing, you're like, oh, I'm relaxing, I'm just watching a video, I feel relaxed. There are so many muscles in your body right now, hundreds in fact, that are working just to keep your body right where it needs to be so you can just sit upright or even lay down and not completely collapse, or just maintain normal functions such as breathing or having your heart beat. The other thing they do is they stabilize joints. So if you have kind of that clicky-clacky hip, for example, one of the things you might think about is it might just be that your muscles need to be worked out in that region, right? So muscles need to be tight enough to keep that joint cavity together, because the only thing holding it together are things like ligaments and bursa and you know, all these different components of the joint cavity, and those aren't exactly strong. Connective tissue is not known for its, you know, overall strength in all of its areas. Some are very strong, but they need support, and that support's going to come from those tendinous attachments and the muscle that's pulling pressure, applying pressure on it. Other things they do is that 98.6 degrees, it sounds like a really hot, miserable day outside, but it's the normal temperature of your body, and you need to maintain it in order for your enzymes to work properly and everything else. So muscles need to generate heat, and as you know, after you've done a really crazy workout, sometimes that heat can be pretty extreme. Oh, it's so hot, right? So they can generate a lot of that heat Other things they do is they perform specific functions, largely based on things like their shape or their position in the body. Teeny tiny ones can help you control your pupil size, like dilate or contract it down so you can modulate light, see things better. Others do things like just give you goosebumps when you have the shivers. They also form different types of structures, such as valves, as well as protects organs as well. Okay, let's talk about how we organize muscle as a structure. Muscle kind of literally undergoes this bundling process. Always think of it like a bundle of teeny tiny sticks that's bundled into other bundles of teeny tiny sticks, and then those bundles of teeny tiny sticks are bundled into a huge bundle of teeny tiny sticks that are bundled and bundled, right? So it's all these bundling kind of phenoform, basically. So each single muscle in your body is referred to as an organ. So that means you have over 600 of them, which is a lot of organs. It breaks down into some basic components, those being where the tendon or the attachments are to connective tissue, then the muscle and muscle body itself. Also, there we go. Also, we're going to look deeper and deeper at those bundlings. So those are going to be the fascicles and some smaller structures within them. And then always the covering as well. So in this case, at the organ level, the large scale, the last covering on the very outside is known as the epimysium because it's epi, it's above, it's on the outside. Okay. So let's take a closer look at that fascicle right here. So this is the fascicle, and what do you know? Again, we have another connective tissue covering. This connective tissue covering is known as the perimysium, right? So what it does is it bundles a bunch of other smaller fibers, just like we talked about. And those fibers are literally fibers. They are the muscle fibers themselves. So a muscle fiber, what we discussed earlier, is literally a muscle cell. It's just multinucleated, right? Many nuclei making up a single cell. So that muscle fiber, let's go ahead and look at that one a little bit. So down here is here's like a bigger version of it. Ooh, that's supposed to be an arrow. It's not an arrow, but it's supposed to be an arrow. Anyway, so here's the muscle cell itself, also known as the muscle fiber. They have nuclei on the outside, as you can see here. They're all squished on the outside. Hold on, let's just clean that up a little. You know what we're talking about. All right. So we have the nuclei, everything squished on the outside. We also have a covering, right? And this covering is the endomysium, right here. It's the last covering, so it covers the muscle cell individually. Also, right underneath it is essentially the membrane, or a membrane of the muscle cell, the muscle fiber, and it's called the sarcolemma, right here, sarcolemma, and it's going to perform a lot of important functions, so know that name especially well. Inside of the sarcolemma, so inside of the muscle cell or the muscle fiber, are all those working units, those contractile units of muscle. Those are referred to as the myofibrils because it's a teeny fiber, right? So that's a myofibril. So that's the breakdown of muscle. Sticks bundled upon sticks upon bundles and bundles and bundles, and different types of mysium, epi, peri, and endo, wrapping them all up together. Here's another exploded view, and this one I want you to kind of take a look at a few important things. So number one, muscles are attached to bone by tendons. That's where the connective tissue of choice. You can see in this cross section all of the fascicles bundled up, but I want you to notice some of these structures, right? So muscle is highly vascularized. That's right, you're going to need a very intense vascularization system in order to get all of those nutrients, especially water and the waste products, out of muscle. Okay? Right. This is just an exploded view of what we call the microscopic anatomy of a skeletal muscle fiber. Right here is a little bit more close up. You can see the sarcolemma. So this is underneath the the endomysium. So this is the sarcolemma. It's going to have a lot of important functions. You can't see those structures in this picture because we haven't talked about them yet. You can see the nuclei being pushed up against the side, right? And embedded in between all of those busy, organized, look at those stripy organizations of the myofibrils, we have the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, as you remember, is an organelle whose job, sole purpose in life, is just to produce tons and tons of ATP for its eukaryotic, single cell houses, right? So that's what they do. That's what they make for us. And they need to be right in the middle of all these myofibrils because they use a ton of ATP to generate those contractions that we need in order to move, right? Move muscle. The other thing I want you to start taking a look at is this band called the striations, right? That stripy pattern. So that stripy pattern is super important. Muscle is highly, highly organized. And if all of these little myofibrils were moving and contorting at their own speed in their own directions, muscle would shred itself. It would fall apart like carne asada should. But there's tons and tons of proteins that make sure that those muscles all move as one giant concert when they're undergoing contractions and relaxations. That's an important point. This is just another micrograph. It's an exploded view of something we saw earlier. So as you can see here, here's the nuclei on the side, pushed up to the side. Can you believe it? You can almost see like the curvature right here of some of these striations of muscle. So that's like it's rotated just a little bit. All of these like dark and light bands, right? So the dark and light bands are going to be where two important proteins we're going to talk about here coming up. So actin and myosin, right? Those are some very important proteins. Those are the two proteins that are key in the sarcomere, and they're going to help us provide the machinery to expand and contract within the myofibrils. An even more close-up look. Yes, this itself is one of the myofibrils, the teeny tiny fibrils, and we're going to get an up-close look at those bands for this little exercise. Okay, so right here, what we're seeing is these two types of fibers. We see these dark, heavy red ones, and then we also see these like lighter blue ones on the side, and it kind of rotates. It does this patterning, right? So here's some red ones, and then we've got the light blue ones, and then red ones, and then we've got light blue ones, and then more red ones. See, that's the band formation that we're talking about. Okay, so when we look at these red ones, this is going to be the myosin. And that's known as the thick filament right here, the thick filament. And then conversely, we're going to have these thin filaments, right? So thin filaments, ooh, sort of circled that. Let's try that again. All right. There it is. A thin filament, that's actin. All right. So actin is going to kind of sometimes overlay in the position of myosin, and that's an important idea, but not all the way, right? So they're still distinct, but they do have that interaction. They're going to overlap at some point. It's that overlap that we're interested in. The degree of overlap tells us about how contracted the muscle is. Here's another close-up look. This is just a single sarcomere this time. So now we know why myosin is called the thick filament, right? Look at how thick it is compared to these like teeny tiny like braids of actin, right, in those overlap zones. And so what they're going to do is they're going to start doing things where the myosin is going to physically connect to the actin. Myosin wants to reach out and grab actin and pull it closer. And every time it does grab it and pull it closer, a contraction begins or is facilitated. And when it lets go or releases, then muscles can relax. And actin moves farther away from myosin, which is why relaxed muscles are longer than contracted muscles, which are shorter. All right, so we'll get more into the details in a couple of upcoming videos. But for now, that's our introduction to muscle tissue types and muscle physiology generally. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Bye.